Gregg Kallor, I'm glad that we could have a few minutes to talk about the world premiere of your new opera, Frankenstein. And also, since it's happening in the same month, the fact that The Telltale Heart is going to be done at the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. So thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's my understanding that you had never read Frankenstein before it was given to you to read, and that you subsequently read it two additional times before you ever started writing any music. And I'm wondering, during those three readings of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, what did you personally find in the story that resonated most with you?
Hmm. I think, there's so much. It's such a rich story. I think the thing that maybe spoke to me the most was this sense of otherness. The creature is perceived as other by Victor, his creator, by all of the humans with whom he comes into contact. And he's persecuted for it. He's treated horribly by everybody because he looks different. That's all they know about him, is how he looks. And the resonance of that, I don't think there's anybody alive or who's ever lived who can't in some way identify with that feeling of being perceived as other, whether it's on the basis of their skin color or their religious beliefs or their gender or political views, whatever the thing is, or a physical disability. And I'm positive that's why this story has endured. It's all about empathy and the lack of empathy, and the tragedy of what happens when we don't treat others with empathy.
Seems like a timely story to be retold, doesn't it?
Timely, timeless. It's I really think that's why. I've been working on this project now for 6 years, which is the longest I've ever spent on any project. And in order to do that, to maintain focus, there has to be such richness and depth and stimulation to keep me engaged and focused. And there is. It's just, Frankenstein is endlessly fascinating. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Even more than composing and working with my collaborators on the performance itself and the production. I've had so many incredible conversations with people outside of the music industry about Frankenstein. I've gotten to talk to scholars, brilliant people who've been studying Mary Shelley and literature all their lives, and they're introducing me to so many new ideas. It keeps sparking more ideas and excitement for it.
You know, if you've been spending 6 years on this, the longest time you've ever spent on a project, that you have to find yourself in the project as well. Is there something that you found of yourself in what Mary Shelley wrote, or are you finding a way of expressing yourself through what you're writing in interpreting what Mary Shelley wrote?
Wow, that's a great question. For sure, there are aspects of the story with which I identify, or which resonate personally. But there's also, there's also a piece of it that I feel a strong connection to Mary Shelley herself. She, in very subtle, beautiful ways, put herself in the story, and but very much behind the curtain, just enough little hints that you can see her, like her initials in the letters that frame the novel, and some of the life circumstances mirror her own. And just the idea that she's offering this tale to people to get them to think about this kind of relationship to other people, and how they view others, and how they're treated, and loss and grief. I just love the idea that she created this incredibly captivating tale, but it feels like an offering, and that she's trying to lead us to a place with more heart. So I think maybe that's the strongest piece that I find a little bit of myself trying to emulate what she's done.
You know, I've always found Frankenstein an interesting book, and then the countless interpretations that have followed, in that we're supposed to understand that this creature that we can't understand is deserving of the same kind of empathy we ourselves would like to get. What do you believe is the role of empathy in understanding the people who don't understand the monster?
It's another great question. we can't control our visceral responses, right? I mean, that's beyond our control. What is within our ability to control is what happens next. Okay, I see someone, I don't understand, or I'm scared, or there's something about this situation that is upsetting or off-putting or confusing. But rather than instantly reacting with violence or in some way that's harsh or callous, is to just take a second and recognize, okay, I'm having this feeling. Am I actually threatened right now? Or is it just, I'm not quite certain what's happening? Can we pause for 1 second and just try to understand? So that, for me, that's what empathy is, trying to understand what's happening there. And I find that over and over in my life, it's very easy to get caught up in the daily struggles that threaten to overwhelm us. Just making it through the day is a challenge for a lot of people, often for most people. And that wears us down and can overwhelm our ability just to put ourselves in someone else's shoes for a second. And I've been finding that no matter what I'm going through in my own life, if I assume that everybody I meet is going through at least that much, then that's a really good starting place.
So is empathy something that can be written into music, or do you hope the totality of the libretto and the music leads us there naturally? Is there something you can do as a composer to sort of say, and here's this?
Man, another really great question. I do hope, of course, that the totality of the piece will lead us there, but I have tried very hard to infuse certain interactions with whatever musical feeling of empathy I could find in that circumstance that felt right. I think it is possible to do that. I know it is possible to do that. And I hope that I've been able to achieve it. The great thing about music is it can amplify whatever emotion is existing in the libretto in that moment. But so it can come out as an attack where that's necessary. It can be very harsh. It can be atmospheric. It can be confusing, but it can also be a warm hug. It can be a very gentle, tender caress. And so I absolutely have striven to infuse parts of the music with that.
And there's a certain level, I assume, there you have to rely on the artists who are bringing your music to life to add more of that themselves through their performance, through their singing, etc.
Always. And it's not even, it is reliance, of course, but it's a privilege to see what they bring to it that I haven't thought of, or that their connection to the music itself and the story adds a layer that I couldn't possibly have written into it. And that's actually been fascinating as we've started the staging rehearsals. At this point, I'm largely a mascot. I'm just a supportive observer, but to watch the director, Sarah Myers, talk to all the cast members about how to inhabit their characters, what personal resonance they find in these characters and their interactions. And they're drawing upon their own life experience, and it's manifesting in ways that I had hoped for, but couldn't possibly imagine just writing alone in my cave. This is a very collaborative project.
Now, the world first got to introduce to some of the work that you did for this when sketches from Frankenstein were performed at the Catacombs in 2017. What did you learn from those performances, and how did that inform the work that you've done leading up to this world premiere at the Opera in Phoenix?
So the director, Sarah Myers, she also directed those initial sketches. In fact, she was the one who suggested that I read the novel in the first place. We've been collaborating on this from the very beginning and through every phase of its development. Watching Sarah work with the singers and creating a physical world for the story in that space was really revelatory in a way. I was very focused on the novel itself, what I had taken from my experience of reading the novel, and how tried to translate that into music. And she and the incredible singers and the cellist Joshua Roman, they brought it to life. It was physical, it was in front of me, and they talked about motivation for this action. Why are you singing this? Why are you going from this point over here to this point over here? And how does that make you feel? And to start thinking about it in that way and seeing it unfold helped me to expand it into a full-length opera, because I guess I had a more expanded and holistic view of how it would come to life, how it would manifest on stage and for an audience, and for people just to find that. It's great. She's so good at creating a space where it's not so much stage action and audience, but just this experience that kind of invites everyone to find their way into it together. So I had to experience that in order to know how to complete the piece.
Did seeing it in the confined space of a catacomb help inspire for what it could be on a much bigger stage? Because I'm assuming you're not confined to a very, very small space like you were in the catacombs.
This is actually the first time. I've known Sarah now since 2016. This is the first time we are actually going to have a proscenium stage and electricity and running water. It's very exciting for us. It did inform it to a certain extent. I think the beauty of her approach and the lighting designer and the set designer is that they're not trying to mimic what happened in the catacombs. You can't possibly. But what they are bringing to it is that same sense of intimacy. That was very important to all of us. We don't want this to be presentational. We want this to be basically an invitation, because the story is so intimate and it's so personal, and it brings up so many personally resonant and difficult associations and feelings. So the idea was, how can we invite people in while still creating an aura, an ambiance. So the catacombs was really useful in clarifying the feel of what we wanted, but she has recast it completely for the spaces that we'll be in. That's the only way it's really going to work.
Right. I thought that the claustrophobia that came along with the catacombs and looking at the video was particularly powerful in watching what was.
Well, it's interesting.
Available.
Yeah, it's interesting that you picked up on that. There are moments really for all of the characters. It's a very claustrophobic existence. I mean, for Victor's fiancée Elizabeth, for instance, who's basically the moral compass of the novel, but at the time in which Frankenstein was set, women were basically in a very small box. They were expected to behave in a certain way, within the confines of their family, within society. So, and then she's further isolated by her fiance, who basically doesn't communicate with her in any real substantive way. So she definitely has a claustrophobic existence. Victor isolates himself. He chooses to leave society, to lock himself in his laboratory, and then to hold his secret. So there's the claustrophobia of knowing what he's done, not being able to share it, being afraid of the consequences. The creature has his own claustrophobic existence because he's isolated by everyone else. It's not by choice, but he is. So it's this interesting, there are all of these individual stories within the larger stories of claustrophobic, isolated existences. And I think that is so resonant for us in 2023, we're still going through a pandemic that has taught all of us in this era what isolation is when we've been alone in our homes. And the increasing prevalence of our digital lifestyles, all of our screens are further isolating us. Our day-to-day human contact becomes more limited and more challenging for a lot of people who have grown up with their phones and their watches and their tablets. I think that is one aspect of the novel that is especially relevant and resonant right now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say the curse of what you just said, of course, is that we don't know how to interact anymore with people. We feel that the devices can do it for us, that we can text. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced wherever it is you are, that people don't know how to walk on the sidewalk with other people because they're picking up phones. They don't know how to drive. I mean, it's becoming, you know, maybe a more solipsistic world
Mm.
as a result of our reliance on what we think the world thinks of us based on, how often we've got our heads buried in one of these.
I I think our capacity for empathy is very strong, and I think that's what makes us extraordinary. I think these devices are distracting us. They're sort of muting some of what we can bring to each other, and because the noise of all these things is so loud and it's so in your face and it's so aggressively intrusive into basically every aspect of our lives, it's hard to filter it out. But when we do, I mean, when I've spent 19 years in New York City, and making eye contact with someone is very difficult because everyone's just rushing to get to where they have to go. But when you do, when you finally make eye contact with a New Yorker, if you ask for help, if you spark a conversation, you find warmth and depth and a not just a willingness, but an eagerness to connect. And that's I think that's true of everybody everywhere. It's just that we are assaulted now by all of these things that prevent that, which is another reason why this art form and all acoustic music art forms are so powerful. It's a chance to just put those things down for an hour or two and just be in a place with other people. And the music, I hope, it speaks past this. It just goes directly to the heart and hopefully engages the mind along the way. But it's a very rare opportunity to just feel. And that's really, more than anything, I think that's what I hope for. I hope for that people take away from the experience of seeing the Frankenstein opera is just this opportunity to feel, to be in touch with themselves and the people sitting next to them.
It's my understanding that you're using primarily Mary Shelley's text for this opera. Now, the way Mary Shelley wrote, the first edition was published in 1818, is very different than the way we speak or the way we express ourselves today. Just as knowing what I know of your music, you don't write the same way as Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, which came out the same year that Frankenstein came out. So what was your approach to marrying, 200-year-old text with contemporary compositional technique?
I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Basically, her prose is beautiful, but you're right. It's not only a little bit foreign to contemporary ears, parts of it would be challenging to set to music in a way that just flowed naturally. Wherever I was able to keep her precise phrases or sentences, I did, if I felt that there wouldn't be a disconnect for our ears now. And happily, I was able to keep a lot of it, but I also, it took me a while to feel comfortable that I wasn't actually mutilating her work, but rather translating it. So I tweaked here and there to simplify the language, but to very much try to convey the essence of her idea, to not change that, just to translate it basically into contemporary vernacular. But there are many direct quotes, both from the novel and from her journal, a few from Paradise Lost, I mean, that which infuses the entire novel. But that was actually one of the most fascinating parts of the process, was how do I keep Mary Shelley's voice in this translation of her work?
And also make it something that's singable, because Mary Shelley wasn't writing for her prose to be sung. You have to keep in mind, if I want to go to a certain note, I need to end with a certain sound because otherwise it's impossible for somebody to sing.
Yeah, maybe the hardest part of the process was convincing myself that the best way to honor her work was not to treat it with precious gloves, but to figure out a way to make it work as music for the exact reason you just mentioned. That took a little doing. You know, it's so brilliant, and I really didn't. At first I was afraid to mess with it in any way, but then I realized, exactly as you said, if this is going to be singable, if this is going to work in this new form, it has to work on its own terms. So finding that balance.
Which multiple artists have had to do over the course of Frankenstein's existence, because it's been turned into plays, it's been turned into movies, it's been turned into one of my favorite comedies of all time. You know, it's been and that was turned into a musical, which is not one of my favorite musicals of all time, and a couple other musicals. What is it about this story that keeps inspiring people to tell their version of Frankenstein?
It speaks to something pretty fundamental about humanity. I mean, it's asking us to think about what it is that makes us human and what it is that makes us a monster, and who's the monster, and whose story is being told. I mean, that's also one of the brilliant things about the novel is there are three different perspectives. She keeps changing. She starts with an explorer who's writing letters, and then this explorer meets Victor Frankenstein, and the story shifts, and he tells it from his perspective, right up until the point where he encounters the creature on the ice on the top of a mountain, and then the story shifts as the creature tells his story to Victor. So the idea of perspective, which today is incredibly resonant. I mean, depending upon which source somebody turns to for news, you're getting an entirely different perspective on the same set of events. So to think about what the story is, how it's being told, who's telling it, and how that affects our ability to empathize, to understand, to connect in some way. And then again, the isolation aspect of it, the otherness and othering aspect of it. I think those are core issues that transcend geographic location, class, era. These are things that are just fundamental to us. Everybody experiences them in some way. So I think that's why the story has endured and thrived and has had so many people trying to bring their experience to it. It's because it's everyone's story.
So what does bringing your experience allow you to say that is above and beyond what Mary Shelley was able to say with Frankenstein?
Well, I wouldn't say it's above and beyond what she was able to say. She did it perfectly. I would
Adjacent to.
Complement.
What do you want to say that complements what Mary Shelley had to say? Because you're right, we do live in a very different world, for obvious reasons, than she lived in 207 years ago.
And yet, in some ways, very little has changed. It's just the circumstances. What I hope to bring to it with this version, with my translation of her work, is really just a different experience of her work of genius. As you said, the novel is over 200 years old, and the prose is quite stylized and can be dense. And I love it. And I think once you find its rhythm, it's gorgeous and it's so rich, and there's so much that can only be gleaned from the experience of reading it. But not everyone wants to or has the time to read it, or not everyone connects to it in that way. And even for people who do connect to it in that way, I think, I don't know if you had this experience in school, but if you're in biology class in high school, say, and you're used to dissecting frogs, and then one day the teacher comes in and puts a poem down on your desk and has everybody read the poem, you're expecting science, but then you get poetry. And because it's a fresh perspective and unexpected, I think we experience it in a different way, with a greater focus, maybe more enthusiasm. And then we start to draw connections, maybe not direct parallels between Keats and a frog, but but somehow in some way that day something changes, something shifts, and there's a little more poetry in our lives. And maybe there's a little, and maybe it's the reverse. In an English class, you deal with some kind of scientific matter, and then that breeds some new perspective. So my hope is that through music, through the staging, it just speaks to people in a way that they might not have experienced in any other way, and that it moves them in some way.
Well, clearly, another work of yours that moves people is The Telltale Heart, uh,
Mm.
which is going to be performed, as I mentioned, by the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center for Halloween, and was even reviewed as a great Halloween tradition, which I hope means it's not just performed on Halloween. But given how challenging it is for new works to get performances after their premiere, or after, if there's multiple institutions that have commissioned it, that once those institutions have had their run, given those challenges of getting other people to perform the work, does the idea of pinning The Telltale Heart to Halloween offer greater opportunities, perhaps, for more audiences to get to see and hear it?
An interesting question. I've thought about that. I think my approach is anything that extends a hand to people and invites them to come experience it is positive. I certainly hope that it is not limited to one day out of the calendar year, and I think that would be a disservice to Edgar Allan Poe. It's a brilliant story, and I think it's effective any day of the year. But certainly, if the association with Halloween is the thing that gets people excited about it, I say that's wonderful.
But it is a challenge to get subsequent work performances, isn't it?
Well, I think that's true across the board. Not specifically for Telltale, but
Like, what do you think the future holds for Frankenstein?
I think it's going to be performed everywhere all the time. um,
Ever the optimist. I love that.
I think what happens is if people get excited about something, they find a way to make it work on whatever terms. The great thing about Telltale, this is actually the first time it's been performed on Halloween. We've done it, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 times, and this is the first. So I'm not particularly worried about that. I think, and in fact, the reason it's happening at Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center is because of Jennifer Johnson Cano, the mezzo soprano, who sang it with me several times in the catacombs and elsewhere. And she is on their roster and has been performing with them a lot. And they were looking for a Halloween program. And she said, "Hey, have you guys heard this piece?" So it fits in beautifully with Halloween. But Frankenstein, The Telltale Heart, I think the stories themselves are so resonant, so that if people enjoy the musical experience of them, I hope that they will program them every day, all days, any day.
Around the world, not just in this country.
That would be delightful.
Of course. One last question for you, Gregg. We've talked a lot about what Mary Shelley wanted to tell and express in this story, and how resonant it is today, and how there are universal themes. What would you like your role to be vis-a-vis Frankenstein in expanding that narrative, and expanding that narrative in an art form that previously hasn't seen or heard this story?
Mm. I guess I'd like to be a cheerleader for the story in a way. I'd like to be a champion of Mary Shelley's story, so that people who haven't yet experienced it can, because I believe so firmly that it will speak to them. I hope my translation of it in this musical form speaks to them, but if they find another way into the Frankenstein story, I really think people would get something out of it. And I've been invited to give a a presentation about the process of creating this opera, of translating the novel. And I'm grateful. It really forced me to think about every step of the process, and to clarify both for myself and then for the people who are listening what it is about the story that excites me so much, and that compelled me to want to tell it in this way. And through that presentation, which I've given a few times, I'm actually doing this week at a local bookstore in Phoenix, I've met some wonderful people who have told me that the themes that they hear me talking about in the novel, and how I'm trying to translate them into the music, made them want to read the book. And I think there may be no greater compliment than having this opera, this music, get people excited about reading Mary Shelley's novel. I've been humbled. I've had these wonderful conversations with Professor Susan Wolfson at Princeton University, who is just a literary god and an incredible scholar and professor, and with Charlotte Gordon, who wrote a dual biography of Mary Shelley and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Dave Gustin, who's a scientist and a professor at Arizona State University. And because I have started this project, I was able to connect with them and with some of their students and some of their colleagues, and to see the excitement about this novel in so many fields and disciplines, and that's what I want to do. I want to be a point of connection between people and the novel, and hopefully that point of connection will include the music that I've written and that this cast and this company are bringing to life.
Very well. That does require one follow-up, if you'll indulge me.
Of course.
What have you gotten out of this? You just mentioned what you'd like other people to get out of it. What have you gotten out of the creation of your own Frankenstein?
Incredible stimulation. I have learned so much as a composer, as a collaborator, as a human. This is the most, the largest, the most ambitious project I've ever worked on. We'll find out in a couple of weeks if it's successful on an artistic level, but on a personal level, the process has been incredible. Just the ups and downs of it. Honestly, it's been very difficult at times. The highs have been unbelievable. The evolution of it, going from working alone to collaborating with individuals to collaborating with groups. Each phase of it grows, and I learn more, not just about the music and the libretto, but also my approach to each phase of it, and my approach to collaboration. And it's also interesting, this project has seen me through 6 years of life now, and a lot of life has happened in that time. So at times it's been a lifeline to me to have this to work on. At other times it's been a burden when there have been deadlines, and my attention is in different places. But in all ways, it's a central component of who I am, this piece, which is an odd thing to be so to have one's soul or identity and so wrapped up with something that I can't even touch. But it's given me that. It's given me rich experience and a lot of personal growth.
And you know, in a couple weeks' time, it will be alive.
It will be alive. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Greg. I've really appreciated it. And are you okay with my posting this interview online?
I am. Thanks so much, Craig. And your questions were beautiful, really, really thoughtful.